But I'd like to start out with a question, though, and it was not in anticipation of how you might feel this morning after your revelry last night, but it's quite a serious question, and it will frame our discussion this morning. So I'd like to start out with this question. If you had an illness in your lifetime, and you could choose which one, but I'm going to force your hand between two of them, which of the following would you choose? For one, would you choose a heart disease in specific? Would you have a heart attack? Or two, would you choose to have a mental illness, in particular serious clinical depression? Let's vote. Well, this is the first time I've ever seen numbers like this. I should have anticipated you would be an unusual crowd, you Australians. Heart disease. Now, this is quite fascinating. I've never tried this out in a general audience. I usually tell this to my students, and behind this is a diagnostic of what you value in life. Do you value longevity? Or do you want to live a long life? And if you want to live a long life, most people would choose mental illness, depression, because you presume having a heart attack is pretty deadly. And even if the doctor resuscitates you, even if you put a new heart in your body, it means that you're on a short timeline towards death. So most people end up choosing depression. Well, I'm done here. If you're not going to play with me, this isn't going to work. All right. No voting again. In fact, I'm taking the questions out of this. I knew if you democratized this damn presentation, I would lose my hand. Okay. So here we have it. Very few people would choose depression, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that you actually took that answer. I don't know why you chose it, and I hope you have read the Global Burden of Disease study. How many of you out there have actually know about the Global Burden of Disease study? Oh, I see a few hands. So most of you are just shooting in the wind there, choosing it. Well, you know then already that in most developed nations, depression is among the leading causes of what we call burden to society. Now, compared to heart disease and cancer, depression doesn't kill as many people. But keep in mind, most suicides have some form of mental illness involved with it. And suicide is a very big problem in all of our nations. But what depression does is keep you alive, but makes living to your fullest damn hard. I struggle with depression because I had a very difficult, to put it lightly, childhood. I won't tell you all my story, but my mother put me in the crib and left and went on a binge and never came back. And it was lucky that my grandparents found me because I had pneumonia and almost died, and that was my start. And it didn't get better for 13 years until my grandmother finally adopted me. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think, in fact, I'm quite sure I wouldn't be alive today. I study mental health because I take mental illness very seriously. Because once you have depression, we know it's one of the leading causes of disability. It puts people at risk for suicide. It prevents you from working fully, enjoying life, so on and so forth. Governments get this now. I'm convinced. I've been traveling around the world because governments have been inviting me saying, well, Corey, I understand that mental illness is a public health issue. Now, when governments say that, that means they're going to divert a great amount of taxpayer dollars to tackle mental illness, or they should be diverting, I should say, a great deal of money towards tackling mental illness to the same degree they tackled smoking and heart disease and cancer and obesity and diabetes. It's that serious. In fact, it's more serious. But here's the challenge. They get that. They don't know what to do. And in the absence of us telling them what to do, psychologists and psychiatrists have a litany of therapies and pills that everyone's well aware of that can be quite useful. They helped me. So I'm not against treatment, I'm not against pills, I'm not against talk therapy. That's what most governments fund right now. And the mantra is this: we can treat our way out of the problem of mental illness. And I'm here to tell you, now, if I had time, how absurd that logic is. We simply do not have enough therapists. I'm sure drug companies would be happy to create enough pills, but we simply do not have enough therapists for a lifetime of a population trying to respond to their mental illness. The idea is we must complement treatment and take it serious and complement it with promoting good mental health. Because as you heard, mental health is more than the absence of illness. We know that now. And now that we know that, we know how to measure it, which I'll talk about next. And now that we know over time losses of good mental health cause mental illness, we know that there is an alternative to treatment. If we promote, we can protect people from becoming mentally ill in the first place. And that will be a tremendous success. So we have to measure what matters. It matters that we measure mental illness. I'm not arguing we shouldn't also measure mental illness, but we also have to measure positive mental health. So on this first slide, I have 3 signs and symptoms of what go into the measurement of positive mental health. And I want you to think about this. I don't have a slide to measure whether you're flourishing, but think about this in the last month. How satisfied, happy, or interested did you feel in this past month? And I want you to think whether one of those signs and symptoms you felt every day or almost every day. Every day or almost every day. All right? Now, this list comes from the ancient Greek philosophy of happiness called Epicureanism. Another word for it is hedonism. Epicurus said happiness is about feelings, feeling good. And he had a recipe for simple pleasures. We won't go into it. But he said, you can seek pleasure, satisfaction, interest, and happiness. And that's a worthwhile goal in life. Aristotle came along, however, and he had a debate about what the good life meant and what happiness was. He did not believe putting feelings before functioning well was the right order of business. In fact, he argued that was putting the cart before the horse. Aristotle said we need to seek a life of excellence. And by excellence, he meant we need to live according to rules and ideals of virtue, trying to be good people, as good as we can be. So he was speaking about how well we should be able to function in this life, that we should function well as individuals and as citizens and members of groups. So on the left-hand side here, you will see 6 signs and symptoms of what we call psychological well-being. This represents how well you function as an individual in your life. And we've tested these measures in children, adolescents, and adults in the US, South Africa, the Netherlands, wherever they'll let us go, and we will measure this. And what we're finding is that individuals think of their lives in terms of these 6 dimensions when they're functioning as an individual. That is, in the pronoun I and me. Do you like most parts of your personality? That's self-acceptance. Do you have warm, trusting relationships with other people? That's positive relations with others. Do you have experiences that challenge you to become a better person? That's called personal growth. Does your life have a sense of direction and meaning? That's called purpose in life. Are you capable of managing your daily responsibilities? That's called environmental mastery. And last, on the psychological side, are you confident to think and express your own ideas and opinions? Now just take this list and go back to your workplace. You want to know if people do not feel confident to express their own ideas and opinions. You want to know if people aren't capable of managing their daily responsibilities. You should want to know if people come to work and don't see it as fulfilling their purpose in life. You should want to know as a manager that your workplace and your communities are not challenging your citizens to become better people. You should want to know if people in the workplace have warm, trusting relationships. And you should want to know if people are accepting of most parts of who they are. So don't tell me this doesn't matter, because it matters to people around the world. And contrary to Bernard Saul, I disagree vehemently. This is not something you pursue when you've taken care of everything else. People pursue this as a fact of life, as a fact of being human. Any community I go, whether it's poor or it's rich, people are struggling for a purpose in life. They're not waiting till they get their bits and pieces in their retirement to do this, are they? And they're asking governments to help them. So I disagree vehemently with that part. Now let's get on to the other list. So functioning well isn't just about I and me. Human beings move fluidly between two different sets of pronouns. 1 minute we're talking like me, it's all about me. And the next breath we're talking all about we, us. We are members of institutions, groups, families, communities, nations. And we face social challenges to functioning well in life, not the least of which is, how accepting are you of other people? That's acceptance of others. Do you feel that when you go home, you have a community, a place, a family where you derive a sense of comfort? Are you socially integrated into society? Third, do you think that we have the capacity to grow and become better people? And is the government, is our workplace challenging us to be a better people? That's called social growth. Fourth, think about the things you do on a daily basis. And think hard about this one. Do they contribute anything of value to your world? That's called social contribution. And last but not least, we live in a complex world. Does it make sense to you what's going on out there? Out there in the halls of your workplace, out there in the streets of your community, out there in your nation. Human beings have a fundamental hunger to understand what's going on. That doesn't mean they have to like it. We want to know why, and we want it to be justified. We will suffer, we will do without if people tell us it's worthwhile. That's social coherence. Those 11 signs and symptoms represent how well we function in life, and they're important to positive mental health. So I want to take you into the next level. Those, when you add them up, 3 emotional well-being, 6 psychological well-being, 5 social well-being, you've got 14 signs and symptoms of positive mental health. Now here's how I put it together. I put it together just like the psychiatrists would when they diagnose depression, except I use it on the positive side. When you say you want people to be mentally healthy, I'm here to tell you it's no longer acceptable that you only mean the absence of mental illness, because this is where you want people to be, flourishing. What does it mean to flourish? That in the past month you felt one of the 3 emotional well-being signs almost every day or every day. Plus 6 out of those 11 signs of positive functioning. Now, tally that up, that's 7 out of 14. We're only asking that you are doing well on 50% of the signs and symptoms. What does flourishing mean? To seek a life of balance. A balance between feeling good about a life in which you function well and trying to do it on a more or less daily basis. There is a problem, however, and it's at the bottom. This is a serious condition that goes unrecognized in society right now because it's not mental illness. It's the absence of good mental health. It means languishing. To languish is the following: to never, or maybe once or twice in the last month, felt one of those 3 emotional and 6 of the 11 positive functioning. And I'm here to tell you, I suspect we've all been in these periods where we felt stuck, stagnant, dead, going nowhere. And what the French call it is ennui. Languishing is a serious condition, and so is moderate mental health, because it's less than mentally healthy. This is called the mental health continuum. So But before I tell you why this is important, I have two more questions I need to ask you now. And please behave, and I'm really worried. I don't even know if I want to ask you. So get yourselves ready. Here are two words. Now, mental illness and mental health. In your mind, do these terms refer to this one, the same thing, or about the same thing? Or two, do they refer to different fundamental things? You're bollocksing me every step of the way. In Canada, we ask this question. Now, I'm not a Canadian, but I spend most of my time up there because the government is moving forward on this agenda at the national level. And I go there because it'll help force the hand in my home country. If Canada does this, then we will finally take it. 60% of Canadians say that mental illness, oh no, this worked out actually fine. I'm looking at the wrong order. Oh, you're beautiful. Yes, most people actually say they're the same thing, but you said they're different things. I'm kidding. In Canada, it's about 60% say that mental illness and mental health are about the same thing. Why? Because sometimes people use the word mental health and they're referring to mental illness. Sometimes they refer to mental health as the absence of mental illness. You got it right, most of you. So almost 8 out of every 10. These refer to fundamentally two different things. Now I thought this was the hard question. Let's go to the next one before I explain why this is important. This is our last question. Bad cholesterol, good cholesterol. In your mind, do these terms refer to the same or about the same thing, or different things? Go. That's a close. Now, you should know. Most of you should know because there's a lot of literature out there that you know the difference between bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. I don't know what happened to that 25% though. They aren't the same thing, and doctors don't go after them in the same way. Statins, how many of you might actually be on statins? You don't have to raise your hand, but if you have high cholesterol, you're referring to high levels of bad cholesterol. And we use statins, one of the most popular and most profitable drugs in the world, to reduce levels of bad cholesterol, and you get pretty good outcomes. But here's an amazing thing. Drug makers discovered that lowering bad cholesterol using statins does not automatically elevate levels of good cholesterol. And then they discovered it takes a different drug to elevate good cholesterol. And when you do two things, lower bad and elevate good cholesterol, you get even better heart health outcomes. The reason I brought this up is because biologically, cholesterol belongs to the two continuum model because it suggests the absence of bad cholesterol does not mean the presence of good cholesterol. And that's true for mental health. Most audiences don't understand that mental health and illness belong to two separate continua. Here's a model of mine that I published. And there's plenty of scientific evidence now to back it up. So north and south, we're going from low at the South Pole up to the North Pole there where you have high levels of good mental health. Left to right, on the right-hand side, you would be free of mental illness, and you cross over the midpoint, you meet a diagnosis for mental illness, say depression or panic disorder. There's lots of scientific evidence now to support that the absence of signs and symptoms and diagnosis of mental illness does not translate into mental health. And here are one of the many implications, and we'll go over this quickly. So if you look to the left side, the most controversial thing about this model says the following. Just because you have a mental illness currently doesn't mean that you have a complete deficit of well-being. You can have some level of mental health coexisting with a current acute condition of depression. Yes, you could be flourishing, and I'll show you data next that many college students are flourishing and with mental illness. If you're flourishing, you're doing far better with a mental illness than if you have moderate. mental health. And if you're moderately mentally healthy, you're functioning far better than if you're languishing with a mental illness. Level of mental health matters with a mental disorder. But suppose, and here's our national strategy, we could cure all mental illnesses today. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, it would up to a point, but this model tells us that we would only be halfway to the point where we want to be. Just because you're free of a mental disorder, you end up on the right-hand side. You could end up languishing or have moderate mental health. We want people all the way up to that top right-hand corner. We want them flourishing and we want them free of mental illness, because level of mental health matters without a mental disorder as well. So let me show you that, some of the implications of this model. First, here's data from over 6,000 US college students. Why focus on college students? I'm a sociologist, I normally don't. I focus on the national population. Here I'm focusing on college students for a specific reason. They're our most advantaged group of people in youth. All right? We would expect them to be the healthiest of the healthiest at this age. Now here's what we find. Using a very good diagnostic tool, in the past week, 25% of them on the left-hand side would fit the diagnosis for either depression, panic disorder, or generalized anxiety. 25% of college students. But here's the trick. Just because they're mentally ill, it doesn't mean they have the absence of good mental health. 5.8% of those kids are flourishing. And they're doing far better than the 16.9% who screen positive for a disorder, but have moderate. And thankfully, only 2.8% are languishing with a mental disorder. So first things first, just because you have a mental disorder, it doesn't mean you have the complete absence of good mental health. Most people are moderate and some are flourishing. But now look to the right-hand side. Normally that's an empty category. We say that 75% are free of those three mental disorders, and what do we assume? Oh my God, what is that? Doesn't matter, we prevail. That 75% free of mental disorder, they're okay. But actually look at the statistics. Less than 50% of our college students are flourishing. This is the highest number I've found in all my studies. I've never found any population where more than half are flourishing, and this is quite deplorable if you ask me. Another almost 30% have moderate, and almost 1% are languishing and free of mental disorder. So just because you're free of a mental illness doesn't mean you're flourishing. Most aren't. Second implication. Level of mental health matters without a mental disorder. Now, here are those same college students. Now, we asked them if they engaged in any suicidal behavior or thinking in the last 4 weeks. Had you thought about it seriously? Had you made a plan? Or did you attempt to kill yourself? Now, these are the kids who, this is the 75% who was free of mental illness. Now, what you see very clearly here is level of mental health will predict your risk of suicide. If you're languishing, you're far more likely to have engaged in some form of suicidality than if you're moderately mentally healthy. And if you're flourishing, it goes down to the lowest level we found, 1.3%. And if you're flourishing, those 1.3 roughly said, I may have thought about it. So the first things first, the vast majority of the population running around free of mental illness is at a pretty high risk of mental illness if they're anything less than flourishing. But here's the kicker. That 25% that had a mental disorder, 7% of those who are flourishing engaged in suicide. It more than doubled if he went up to moderate, or down to moderate, I should say. And look at what happens if you're languishing with a mental disorder. You're off the charts. Very high risk of suicidality. So, I've shown in paper after paper this canonical pattern. When I say anything less than flourishing results in burden to your organizations, burden to your communities, burden to your nation, I'm talking about anything less than flourishing with and without a mental disorder in the following ways. We've shown this in disability. Anything less than flourishing results in more disability. It results in more health claims, visits to doctors for physical as well as mental reasons. It results in having more medical prescriptions written for you. It results in more hospitalizations. And yes, it results in more missed days of work. You add it up. Huge amounts of money are being blown out the door because we're not focusing on the huge problem of the absence of good mental health. So, what can we do about it? Well, the third implication is the following. If you talk to a doctor, he or she will tell you illness is the most serious thing facing us right now. And if you talk to me and people focus on positive health, we will say health is the most serious thing. Now you know we're not talking about the same things, right? We're not. Here's what a doctor's saying and arguing for more money. What he says, or she said, Corey, I need to solve the problem of mental illness before I give you money to go doing this nice little thing you're talking about, promoting well-being. We can't accept that because they're wrong, and we have the scientific evidence. And why? Because changes in good health precede and cause risk for the things they take serious. It's just that their modality is what? Bring you to the clinic and I'll solve it. Well, the solution is out in society, in your workplaces, in your communities, in your spiritual workplaces, everywhere else. You have to promote well-being to prevent mental illness. And that's why I say health is far more serious than illness in this century. Because when we lose it, we risk becoming mentally ill. So I'll just show you how much this changes over a 10-year period in the US adult population, and then tell you what we found. So this data comes from a big national study of US adults. In 1995, they were between the ages of 25 and 74, and we followed them up 10 years later. Now what I have here is those who were languishing in 95, and I'm just looking at how much this stuff changes. So the bad news is this: if we do nothing, 45% on their own who are languishing in 95 stay that way over time. 45% in 95 stayed languishing, and they were languishing in 2005. Here's the good news. On their own, 51% went up to moderate mental health, and on their own, 4% went up to flourishing over that 10-year period. 55% improved. So this is good news, and I'll tell you why that's good news. Second, let's look at moderate. If you were moderate mentally healthy in 95, 67% went on to stay that way. Now this is a very important group. In the US, roughly 40% to 50% of the entire US population sits in moderate mental health. This is a huge, huge number of people. Roughly 10% of adults are in the languishing category. And you can imagine then that leaves very little for flourishing. But look at that, 67% stay. 14% of those people migrate down to languishing, and they entirely balance out the gains that languishers who improved, right? So that 55% that improved go on, but that 14% that declined fill right back up the prevalence of languishing. Because at the population level, the prevalence didn't change over that 10-year period. And here's flourishing. The good news, I don't know if it's good news or bad news, 51% stayed flourishing over that time period. The bad news is this: if we do nothing, we lose almost as many who are flourishing. 46% went down to moderate, 3% went down all the way down to languishing. Now here's why this is important. Everyone in red who stayed or became languishing were 6 to 8 times more likely than those people who stayed flourishing to develop a new kind of mental illness in 2005. In fact, and listen carefully, those people in red had a higher risk of developing mental illness over that 10-year period than the people who started out with one of them in 95. I kid you not. Adults who had a mental illness starting out in 95 were 5 times more likely to have one in 2005. Languishers were 6 to 8 times more likely. Languishing is a higher risk for developing mental illness than having had one in the first place. Now, everyone in yellow were 4 times more likely to develop a mental illness in the future. Now, that's almost as high as those people who started out with one in 95. That group in the green, the people who stayed flourishing, are those people who stayed or became flourishing, were at the lowest risk possible for developing mental disorder. Now, here is the problem facing the US, and I don't think we're alone in this. There were barely 23% in 2005 who were flourishing. 18.5% had mental illness. The rest, that's roughly 50%, were free of mental illness to start with in 95, but they had as high or a higher risk of developing mental illness in the future. Why? Because they had either moderate mental health or they were languishing. 5 to almost 6 out of 10 American adults have as high or higher risk of developing mental illness than those who start out with it. Again, why? Because they are less than truly mentally healthy. What do we do for them? Nothing. What's the solution? Complementing treatment with a focus on protecting the lost against flourishing and promoting those who aren't flourishing. We do have a solution. Now let's look at this over the lifetime, because I know you're interested in this in the lifetime, and then this will bring me to the end. Here is the same, the group of adults as we followed them. In blue is where they were at that age is shown on the bottom in terms of their prevalence of flourishing. The red bar represents where they landed as they aged 10 years. Let's start on the left. Here's the good news. The youngest adults improved in flourishing by 18%. The next youngest improved in terms of flourishing. Flourishing went up by 11%. Those in the middle years, 26% improved in terms of flourishing. And this group improved by 20%. But here's the bad news. You live long enough, and we are living longer lives. This is roughly the age where you retired and you spent your first 10 years in modern retirement. What did you get? As a population in the US, we had a 14% decline in good mental health. What happens? You can figure it out. Why does depression rise in late life? Because we lose our sense of purpose. We lose our sense of contribution to society. We don't belong anywhere anymore. We thought our workplaces were our homes and our communities. On and on. So why the loss? Now let's look at it over the entire lifespan. This includes our studies on kids, adolescents. Remember this when you go home, because I think Australia looks a lot like this. There's no place where we find more than half flourishing. We start out in our kids in middle school, before they reach high school, almost 50% are flourishing. We lose 10% in high school, and look where they start. So this is the first problem area we as a nation, as an organization, need to face. By the time they start their families and their work, they're at the lowest level of good mental health. Think of it this way. Getting them ready to work and start their family has soaked up or sucked out most of the gas in their tanks. And we do nothing except say, be a good parent, be a good employee. They're running on empty. The good news is this. Once you've raised your family and you've started to get some security in your workplace, there's the midlife increase. But towards the end of your career and once you retire, wham, the second dangerous period arises. And I know what Bernard was talking about in retirement, right? We are expecting you to be good managers of our funds so we can use it for all this good stuff. Well, the US is doing that too, but it's whatever you're doing isn't focusing on the things that matter to people because they're losing their well-being. money isn't the answer. It's just the means. What are they focusing on? Well, what does society gain if you focus on flourishing? Well, here it is. We can reduce the amount of mental illness in our population. 2, we can reduce the risk of suicidality, which was high at the beginning of life, and it soars at the end of life. 3, we can reduce the risk of premature mortality. I have a paper coming out right now that shows it's not mental illness that's causing risk of mortality. Flourishing adults at all ages, male and female, have the lowest risk of 10-year all-cause mortality. And we can't explain it away. That's important. And last but certainly not least, we get better functioning. We get what we want in our workplaces, people who are engaged, who want to master new skills, because they see it as aligned with their purpose, with their integration, with their contribution, with their sense, with their opinions, you name it. So let me leave you with this. If we really want a better workplace, if we want a better society, you better start with the end in mind. And if all you want is the absence, you're blind. You need to fill it with something positive, because that's what people want. Call it what you want. I'll call it flourishing. You call it well-being. You call it wellness. You call it anything. But start with the end in mind, or you're going to get nowhere. And second, you better start focusing on it, because human beings become what we focus on. You ever notice dog owners? They start to look like their dogs? Yeah. You focus on illness, you're worried you're going to become sick. Focus on what is good about life and make it more available to you. Measure it so you can hold each other accountable, your nations and your workplaces. And then promise me you'll start promoting it. Thank you.